Okay, welcome to the fourth part of the ornithology course for the Ohio Certified Volunteer Naturalists. My name is Matt Schumar. I am program coordinator of the Ohio Bird Conservation Initiative at The Ohio State University in the School of Environment and Natural Resources. So in this fourth section, this is going to be the final pre-recorded video before we do our live in-person activities and finish up the course. In this final video, we're going to talk about the full life cycle and what it means to observe birds. There's going to be a lot of content to cover in this short video. It'll hopefully be about the same length as the previous three. So hopefully it feels like there's a unified theme here, but a lot of what we're going to be talking about will hopefully be a jumping off point for the in-person session. So I concluded the previous video with the idea of full life cycle ecology. This is, or has been, an emerging topic in wildlife biology, particularly ornithology. So the idea here is that we need to really pay attention to what an organism needs throughout the course of its life, and that those needs likely change throughout different periods. This is very true of birds. Historically, a lot of the attention and conservation focus for birds has been on breeding season. It's really only been in the last 10 years or so that we've shifted that emphasis to try to understand holistically what an animal needs and how we can apply that to conservation efforts. So if we take a look at this bird photographed here, this is a female magnolia warbler in the fall. This is a species that is a relatively uncommon or rare breeder within the States, but it is a common transient migrant. It's not very difficult to get an opportunity to see magnolia warbler in Ohio during May. And I've indicated that with the star here. So most of you, if you've seen magnolia warbler, that's likely been during my spring migration. At this point, the birds are in their colorful alternate plumage. The males are singing. They're fairly easily detectable. However, there's an opportunity to observe magnolia warbler throughout the course of a year, and the species needs may change over that time. During spring and fall migration, when you've seen magnolia warbler, it's probably been in a lot of different places, basically anywhere where there's tree cover or some sort of forest patch. That bird might be refueling for migration. They typically nest in, at least in Ohio, in mixed coniferous forest, often with hemlock. At higher elevations outside of Ohio, they nest in deciduous stands, but the microclimate and conditions aren't quite correct in Ohio at lower elevations in deciduous forest. So if we're thinking about conserving magnolia warbler populations, we need to put less emphasis on those uncommon hemlock stands within the state and really think about potential stopover locations, and are we supplying habitat for this species as it makes its way from South and Central America into boreal breeding grounds. Another example of the idea of full life cycle ecology is thinking about rose-breasted grosbeak and what it needs. So this is a slightly more common breeder within the state of Ohio. Rose-breasted grosbeaks can be found throughout southeastern Ohio and in other locations of the state in mature deciduous forest. So somewhat sizable forest patches like the one photographed here on the left, you have a pretty good chance of seeing a rose-breasted grosbeak. And most of you are more familiar with the male's breeding plumage, that alternate plumage, the nice contrasting black and white with a red triangle on its chest, shown here in the second photograph. Both of these photographs, or both of these images, were taken in West Virginia during the breeding season, in very similar topography and forested conditions that we see in southeastern Ohio. If you open up your field guides or you go to All About Birds birds, you're probably going to see information about rose-breasted grosbeak being a mature deciduous forest species. And that's very true. This bird does nest in larger tracts of mature deciduous forest. But that's only a small portion of this species' annual life cycle. Rose-breasted grosbeaks actually use a variety of habitats, and during the post-breeding period of the year, this is after young have left the nest, and it's kind of in between that breeding period and migration. Rose-breasted grosbeaks will actually move into early successional forest, clear cuts, like the one shown here on the third image from the left. This is a clear cut in around the Wayne National Forest, and in a lot of the work that we've done in Appalachian stands, we've sampled and caught many rose-breasted grosbeaks in mist nets in clear cuts, and they're using these clear cuts pretty heavily during this time period. Turns out there are a lot of mature forest breeding birds, thrushes, and some of the warblers that are using these stands extensively late in the summer prior to migration. And we'll talk about some of those reasons in a moment. Rose-breasted grosbeaks winter in northern South America. This photograph on the far right is one that I took in a shade coffee plantation in Colombia a few years ago. This is an adult male in its non-breeding or basic plumage. We can tell the difference between non-breeding males and females by the hue underneath their arms and on their chest. You can see some pink here, right under the wing feather there, and some faint traces of that red triangle on its chest. And so, they're using stands that may look a little bit more similar to that early successional forest that we have here in temperate North America, with some overstory trees. They're using these stands quite heavily, and it turns out there are a number of forest breeding neotropical migrants that use these shade coffee plantations in Central and Northern South America. So why would forest obligate breeding birds use early successional habitat? Well, there are a couple reasons for that. One are the abundant food resources that help facilitate foraging. So the vegetation in these young regenerating forests is really dense, and as a result, there's often a lot of fruit in here. They're really high in rubus stems, and so that's raspberry and black raspberry. And there's also really high insect abundance in these dense regenerating stands as well. So there's a lot of food, and they need that food during this period as they undergo molt and as they sort of fuel up to get fat reserves prior to migration. So I mentioned molt. After the breeding season and prior to and even a little bit during migration, birds are undergoing molt. They're replacing their feathers. Many of the songbirds are undergoing what's called a pre-basic molt. So they're molting out of their really colorful alternate breeding plumage into a more drab basic plumage. And this photograph, this wing photograph here, is actually, again, of a rose-breasted grosbeak. This was a second-year female that was caught in a mist net at Powder Mill Avian Research Center. And you can see the coloration difference that we can use to age this particular bird. So during this time period when they're regrowing their flight feathers, they're highly vulnerable to predation. And so that dense, really dense vegetation in a young regenerating forest stand supplies a lot of cover and reduces predation risk. So there are a lot of reasons why forest obligate breeders are using these early successional habitats really heavily. And so it's important that we consider the needs of species like rose-breasted grosbeak or magnolia warbler throughout the course of a year so that we are conserving the appropriate habitat that the species needs. And we can think about that for a number of birds. If you recall from the first video, we talked about there being over 400 species that have been documented in the state of Ohio, and only 200 of those are breeding. So about half of the birds that we observe, and most of those that we observe on a regular basis, are actually nesting within Ohio. But those other 200 species may be using Ohio at various times of the year, somewhat regularly. If we think about Veery, photographed here, this is a species that's a relatively uncommon breeder, but it's fairly common during migration. We have very few sites within the state that continually host veeries, but it's not very difficult to see the species during migration. So if we're thinking about Ohio's contribution to conserving the species, if we only think about breeding habitats, we have a very limited contribution. However, because a lot of northern breeders are passing through Ohio, I would argue that we have a strong responsibility to ensure that we have high quality stopover habitat for this species. And so really, if you think about what Ohio's contribution or responsibility is, it's everywhere from April through November in providing habitat for this species, as it is a fairly common migrant. So let's think about migration and put some more emphasis on that. We're just getting into spring migration now, so hopefully some of you are getting outside on a regular basis and keeping track of the new birds that you're seeing day to day. Migration is really exciting for bird watchers, but it's a normal process for hundreds of species within North America. Why do it? It's energetically taxing, and there's a high risk of mortality. There's research done at Hubbard Brook Bird Observatory showed that with black-throated blue warblers, mortality during migration was at least 15 times higher than during breeding or overwintering period. So this is a really dangerous period in a bird's life. Why go to all that trouble? Well, the reason that birds migrate, sometimes incredible distances, is to exploit abundant resources that are available across the globe throughout different times of the year. Birds are really concentrated in Central and Northern South America during the non-breeding season because that's where the resources are available at that time. So if you are tracking this animated image of green vegetation throughout the course of the year, you'll see that during November, December, into February, the green within North America is really concentrated to the southeast. But as we get into spring and early summer, that explodes to the tree line of boreal Canada. And so birds are moving across the globe to exploit these resources to increase their success throughout any given time of the year. So there's a lot of payoff for migration. So if we're thinking about conserving habitat, we need to think not only about breeding habitat, but potentially stopover habitat as well. American redstart, shown on the right, is another species that nests within Ohio, but is much more common as a transient migrant. They like forest with a lot of mid-story, so some regenerating forest, canopy gaps along trails, anywhere where there's sort of low and mid-story vegetation in a forested system is really great for American redstart. Rusty blackbird, shown on the left, is a non-breeding species for the state of Ohio, but it is not too difficult to find during migration and even overwintering. This is a species that has shown dramatic population declines, and there's a lot of concern for them. So Ohio actually has really important habitat for staging the species during migration. We find that they use the Western Lake Erie Basin marshes pretty extensively, and forest and field areas throughout Western and Central Ohio pretty extensively. So we could contribute a lot to rusty blackbird conservation by ensuring that we have appropriate habitat during migration. The same is true for overwintering species, those species that actually spend the course of a year within Ohio. Carolina wren is one that really comes to mind. This is a southern breeding species. We've talked about this bird a little bit in the videos. And it's really limited in its northern extent by extreme cold weather. Um, if we go back and think about that breeding bird survey population trend that I showed you earlier in this video series, we saw how cyclical it was and how that related to extreme winter weather events. So by providing cover and habitat for the species during winter, we might be able to conserve its populations during these critical time periods. So Carolina wren is one, northern bobwhite is another that has shown very strong links to prolonged snow cover and extreme cold. So thinking about providing feathered transition edges or scrubby edges between field and forest, brush piles, things like that can really go a long way to helping bird populations during winter periods. And it's at this point that I really want to emphasize the strong potential for individual landowners or citizens in bird conservation. You know, within all of these videos and a lot of what I talk about, we cover citizen science fairly extensively. And we're going to talk more about citizen science in the in-person class session coming up next week. But there are a number of other things you can do. One, drink shade-grown coffee. I talked about that briefly with rose-breasted grosbeak. There are a lot of species that use shade-grown coffee plantations in northern South America and Central America for habitat. Also, let's keep areas safe during migration as well. So make your windows safer, keep cats indoors, use native plants and avoid pesticides. So this is a set of 7 simple things that the Cornell Lab of Ornithology put together last year to encourage homeowners to contribute to bird conservation. I think it's a really great list, and I encourage you to try to incorporate all of these things into your everyday lives. So going back to migration and what individuals can do, this is where I think folks can have a really important contribution just by doing something simple like treating your windows or turning off your lights during migration. Nearly 1 billion birds are killed in the United States alone by building collisions each year. And with our Ohio Lights Out program, this is a program that I help coordinate through OBCI to make urban landscapes safer for migratory birds. We have volunteers that go out and survey downtown areas for injured and dead birds. And we found over 3,000 birds in cities of Ohio last year. If you take a look at this pie chart, you'll see that most of the collisions are actually happening at low-rise buildings and private residences, not necessarily high-rise. So homeowners have a lot of potential here to help save bird populations simply by making their homes safer. There are lots of easy things you can do. The idea is just to cut down on reflectivity. So there are lots of products like ABC bird tape, feather-friendly DIY tape, or even hanging parachute cord in front of your windows like the one shown here on the right. So take homes with this. It's important to understand that no single habitat will support all species. So we don't want to say that we need all forest in Ohio, or we need all grasslands. That's simply not going to be the case. It's also true that birds' needs, so an individual bird, its needs differ across their annual cycles. They may use very different habitats during the breeding season, during post-breeding, during migration, and during overwintering. So we need to consider that. Conservation plans strongly need to consider these. You know, we've focused a long time on breeding habitats, but it's important that we think about those other time periods and incorporate those into our conservation planning. But also consider how your park that you work at or volunteer at or your home contributes to the landscape. Do you have vegetation that you might be able to manage that migrants can use during spring and fall? Are your buildings, is the nature center at your park, do they have safe windows? Does your home as well? So thinking about those things. And not taking generalized habitat associations at face value. it's a great starting point to think of species like rose-breasted grosbeak or worm-eating warbler as forest breeders. But we need to acknowledge that they also need scrub-shrub habitat during their annual life cycle, and that they're using different habitats. The same is true for eastern bluebirds. That species, which uses fields, often will move into regenerating thick, scrubby vegetation during the post-breeding season prior to migration. To get a better understanding of this, field observations are invaluable for understanding habitat details. So I encourage you to really watch birds, watch what they're doing and at different times of the year. That is really important. And so just to wrap up here, I want to go back to what we started with helping us to figure out what birds that we're looking at. So towards the end of that hierarchy that we talked about, behavior and vocalizations are incredibly important. So we're not going to talk much about plumage in here. That's what field guides are for. You can toil over plumage details until you get sick of it. But a lot of these other important aspects listed above are what we're going to cover during this course. So behavior and vocalizations. This is where becoming an observer or really a tuned in naturalist come into play. So I encourage you to watch birds. And we can learn a lot by very simple behaviors. How a bird is carrying itself. You've maybe heard about the gist or the jizz of a bird, but the overall impression that you get from a species. So much in identification comes more from just an overall impression of a bird than, say, very fine details in its plumage or vocalization. Old Peterson guides used to include these. This is actually taken from one of the Golden guides, very similar to the Peterson style, which was discontinued a couple decades ago. And it's a shame that more modern field guides don't include this, because I think it's a really important concept. So what they're trying to get across here is where birds sort of partition themselves within habitat. Is it a ground-dwelling bird? Do they typically move in the lower understory or mid-canopy? Or is it a bird that likes to perch high? Also look at the silhouettes here and how a bird kind of carries itself. Look at the mimids and thrushes compared to, say, starling or mourning dove, similar sized birds, flycatchers, which are more straight. These are really important because often this is a silhouette or just a brief impression is maybe only what we get to see from a particular bird. And for some birds that have overlapping distributions and look very, very similar, sometimes silhouette or behavior is the only thing we have to help identify them. Think about our corvids, those blackbirds, large blackbirds like American crow, fish crow, and raven. For the longest time in Ohio, we really only had to worry about American crow. If you saw a large blackbird, that's what it was. But we now have a very small population of breeding fish crows established in the Cleveland area, and common raven is reestablishing itself in southeastern Ohio. Crows and ravens often get confused, especially in their vocalizations, because young American crows can sound like ravens. However, the birds have very different silhouettes. American crows have a tail that's squared off. It looks a lot more like a tail like that of an American robin, whereas ravens have this long wedge-shaped tail. And so even in flight, if we don't have a size, something to compare them to, we can generally easily identify those based on their silhouettes. So that's really important as well. And to end our last video session here, I want to go out with a quiz. And so let's say you're out in an agricultural landscape and sun's just coming up and you see this bird pop up. You don't have any plumage characteristics to help identify it, and it's not vocalizing. What is it? Well, based on the way this bird is holding itself, the position of its tail, is really useful for identification purposes. So I'll give you a moment to think about it, and then we'll talk about what it is. You have it? Well, if you guessed northern mockingbird, you were right. Or if you guessed even a mimid in general, so brown thrasher or gray catbird, you were close. These birds often sort of jump around with their tails popped up like this. So pay attention to how birds are sort of sitting or standing within the habitats, because that can be really useful. And I look forward to talking about some of these concepts in our course next week. If you'd like to get in touch with me, here's my contact info. Again, I am at The Ohio State University, or you can visit obcinet.org to find out more about our programming. Thanks.